The digital clock on the dashboard glowed a sterile green. 2:02 a.m. Rain lashed against the bulletproof glass of the Maybach, blurring the neon lights of the Boston skyline into violent streaks of red and gold. Kieran didn't care about the storm outside. His eyes were locked on the trembling woman sitting in his passenger seat. Madeline tried to pull the damp silk scarf higher around her neck, her breath hitching in a quiet, broken sob. But she was too slow. Kieran reached out, his knuckles scarred and ruthless, and gently brushed the fabric aside. In the dim light, the brutal, finger-shaped bruises blooming across her collarbone were undeniable. The silence in the car shattered. And in that suffocating 2 a.m. darkness, the last thread of Kieran's humanity snapped, making way for a monster that demanded blood. To the elite circles of Massachusetts, Madeline Lawson lived a life woven from pure silk and privilege. She was the envy of Beacon Hill, the stunning, soft-spoken wife of State Senator Ricky Lawson. Photographs in the local tabloids captured them at charity galas and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Ricky, flashing his blinding, charismatic smile, and Madeline, the perfect porcelain doll standing obediently at his side. But porcelain is fragile, and behind the heavy mahogany doors of their historic townhouse on Louisburg Square, Ricky made sure Madeline remembered just how easily she could break. The abuse was never public. It was calculated, terrifying, and methodical. Ricky was a man obsessed with control, a politician who navigated the filthy underbelly of campaign finance by day and brought his paranoia home by night. He never hit her in the face. That would ruin his political optics. Instead, his rage manifested in gripping her wrists until the tendons popped, slamming her shoulders into door frames and leaving deep, agonizing bruises on her ribs where the tailored lines of her designer dresses would hide them. Madeline had long ago stopped crying. Survival had stripped her of her tears, replacing them with a hollow, mechanical endurance. To escape the suffocating walls of her marriage, she had insisted on maintaining her career as a high-end sommelier. Ricky had only allowed it because it played into his narrative of being a progressive, modern husband. He secured her a position at the Cavern, an exclusive, ultra-private subterranean club in the financial district, catering to the city's billionaires, judges, and apex predators. It was at the Cavern where Madeline first became aware of the shadow that was Kieran Walsh. Kieran was not a man who sought the spotlight. At 34, he was the undisputed architect of the Irish-American syndicate operating out of South Boston, controlling the ports, the underground casinos, and a vast network of untraceable logistics. He was a ghost in tailored charcoal suits, possessing cold, calculating grey eyes that seemed to strip away the flesh and look straight into the bone. When Kieran entered a room, the temperature dropped. Men of immense power lowered their voices. Even the arrogant politicians who frequented the club gave his private corner booth a wide, respectful berth. Madeline was assigned to his section on a bitter Tuesday evening in November. She had heard the whispers in the staff break room. Don't look at him too long. Don't speak unless spoken to. Pour the Macallan and vanish. She approached his table, carrying a bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux he had requested. Kieran was seated in the corner, flanked by two massive men who radiated quiet violence, though Kieran himself sat perfectly still. He was reading a leather-bound ledger, a heavy crystal glass already resting near his fingertips. "Good evening, Mr. Walsh," Madeline said, her voice a practiced velvet whisper. Kieran didn't look up immediately. He finished scanning the page, closed the ledger deliberately, and then raised his eyes. The moment his gaze met hers, Madeline felt a strange, cold jolt in her chest. His eyes weren't just grey, they were like storm-tossed oceans, churning with an intelligence that was acutely dangerous. "Madeline," he read her discreet silver name tag. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated over the ambient jazz of the club. "You're new to my section." "Yes, sir. The management thought my expertise with Bordeaux would suit your request tonight." She uncorked the bottle with practiced efficiency, but as she tilted the neck over his glass, a sharp, sudden spike of pain shot up her left arm. That morning, Ricky had discovered a missing dry-cleaning receipt and had twisted her arm up behind her back until she thought the socket would give way. The phantom pain flared violently. Her hand trembled, just a fraction of an inch, but enough that the heavy red wine splashed slightly against the rim of the crystal glass. Madeline froze, her breath catching in her throat. A mistake. A flaw. In her world with Ricky, a spilled drop of wine meant a night of terror. She instinctively braced herself, her shoulders pulling up, her eyes dropping to the floor in immediate submission. "I am so sorry, sir. I'll replace the glass immediately." Kieran's right-hand man, a scarred brute named Declan, shifted forward, his jaw tightening, but Kieran held up a single, long finger. Declan stopped instantly. Kieran didn't look at the spilled wine. He looked at Madeline. He looked at the way her shoulders had instinctively hitched toward her ears. He saw the microscopic flinch, the sudden, shallow breathing. He recognized it. It was the same body language he saw in men who owed him money and knew they were about to be beaten. It was the posture of prey. "Leave the glass," Kieran said softly. Madeline hesitated, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs. "Sir, I said, "Leave it, Madeline." There was no anger in his tone, only an absolute, unyielding authority. He reached out and wrapped his large hand around the stem of the glass. As he did, his knuckles brushed against her wrist. Madeline suppressed a wince, pulling her hand back quickly. The cuff of her white uniform shirt slid up just a quarter of an inch, revealing the nasty, yellowing edge of a bruise circling her forearm. Kieran's eyes tracked the movement. He saw the discoloration before she hurriedly pulled the cuff down. The air around the table seemed to thicken, the ambient noise of the club suddenly fading into a low hum. Kieran Walsh was a man who noticed everything. He dealt in leverage, in secrets, in the hidden weaknesses of powerful people. But as he looked at the beautiful, terrified sommelier, the cold calculation in his mind was momentarily derailed by something entirely foreign. A flash of dark, primal irritation. "Take your time pouring the next one," Kieran said, his gaze never leaving her face. "No one is rushing you here." Madeline swallowed hard, nodding mutely. She finished pouring the wine, bowed her head, and retreated into the shadows of the club. Kieran watched her walk away, his jaw clenching slightly. "She's Senator Lawson's wife," Declan murmured, leaning in close so only Kieran could hear. "Moonlight's here. The senator is in bed with the Volkoffs, Kieran. We shouldn't have his wife pouring our drinks." Kieran took a slow sip of the Margot, rolling the expensive vintage over his tongue, though he tasted nothing. His mind was replaying the flinch, the fear in her eyes, the bruise. "Make sure she's the only one who serves this table from now on," Kieran ordered quietly. Declan frowned. "Boss, that's a political landmine." Kieran slowly set the glass down. "Did I stutter, Declan?" "No, boss." Kieran leaned back against the red velvet booth, blending into the darkness. Ricky Lawson was becoming a nuisance to the syndicate's operations in the Docklands. But suddenly, politics and territory were the furthest things from Kieran's mind. He had just found a crack in the senator's perfect facade, and Kieran was going to pry it wide open. Over the next 3 weeks, a dangerous, unspoken routine developed in the dimly lit corners of the cavern. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Kieran Walsh arrived at 10 p.m., and every Tuesday and Thursday, Madeline was the only staff member permitted to approach his booth. For Madeline, these interactions became a bizarre sanctuary. In a life dictated by walking on eggshells around a monstrous husband, pouring drinks for Boston's most feared crime boss was ironically the only time she felt completely safe. Kieran never touched her. He never made lewd comments like the Wall Street bankers in the VIP lounge. He simply watched her. He asked her questions, small, probing inquiries delivered in his rough, quiet voice. "You look tired tonight, Madeline. Are they overworking you?" he asked one evening, casually cutting the end off a Cuban cigar. "Just a long week, Mr. Walsh," she lied, hiding her trembling hands behind her back. Ricky had kept her awake until 4 a.m. the previous night, interrogating her about a phone call from her sister he deemed disrespectful. "You're limping," Kieran noted on another occasion, his eyes tracking her as she approached the table. Madeline froze. She had disguised the limp perfectly, or so she thought. "I dropped a heavy wine crate on my foot in the cellar. I'm fine." Kieran struck a match, the flame illuminating the hard, ruthless planes of his face. He held her gaze as he lit the cigar, puffing slowly. "You should be more careful around heavy things," he said softly, the double meaning hanging heavy in the smoke between them. "Some things look stable until they crush you." Madeline's breath hitched. He knows. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. There was no way a man as powerful and connected as Kieran Walsh didn't know who she was. He knew she was married to Senator Lawson, which meant he knew the excuses were lies. But he didn't push. He didn't expose her. He just observed, gathering data like a predator, studying a wounded bird. Meanwhile, the situation at the townhouse on Louisburg Square was deteriorating rapidly. Ricky's re-election campaign was facing unexpected hurdles. A local investigative journalist had started digging into the zoning permits Ricky had rubber-stamped for the Russian Volkov family, Kieran's direct rivals. The pressure made Ricky erratic, and his violence grew less calculated. One evening in early December, Madeline was in the master bathroom, carefully applying thick foundation to a nasty blue bruise on her jawline. It was a risky place for him to hit her, and Ricky had been instantly apologetic afterward, buying her a diamond tennis bracelet she left untouched in its velvet box. The bathroom door burst open. Ricky stood there, his tie loosened, holding a stack of Madeline's bank statements. His face was flushed with whiskey and rage. "What is this?" he hissed, stepping into the bathroom and cornering her against the marble sink. Madeline's heart rate skyrocketed. "Those are my savings from the club, Ricky. We agreed I could keep. You have $5,000 in an account I don't control," Ricky roared, slamming his hand against the mirror, cracking the glass. "What are you doing, Madeline? Are you preparing to leave me? Are you planning to make a fool out of me right before the primaries? No, Ricky, please. It's just emergency money." He grabbed her by the throat. The grip was instantaneous, cutting off her airway. Madeline choked, her hands flying up to claw desperately at his thick wrists. "You don't have emergencies," Ricky spat, his face inches from hers, his breath reeking of scotch. "I provide everything. You are nothing without me. Just a pretty, pathetic waitress I elevated. If you ever try to leave, I will destroy you. I will make sure the press thinks you're a hysterical, pill-popping whore, and then I will bury you." He shoved her backward. Madeline's spine collided with the sharp edge of the marble bathtub. She crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, tears of agony springing to her eyes as pain radiated through her lower back. Ricky stood over her, adjusting his cuffs. "Clean yourself up. We have a fundraiser at the Omni Hotel in an hour. Wear the blue Valentino. It covers the back." That night at the fundraiser, Madeline moved like a ghost. She smiled when required, nodded at the wealthy donors, and stood dutifully beside the monster who was currently leading in the polls. The pain in her back was excruciating, a deep, throbbing ache that made breathing difficult. Across the opulent ballroom, standing in the shadows near the exit, was Kieran Walsh. He wasn't an invited guest, but a man like Kieran went wherever he pleased. He was there to send a silent, intimidating message to the Volkovs' political puppets. But as he stood in the darkness, sipping a glass of club soda, his eyes found Madeline. He saw the rigid way she held her spine. He saw the microscopic tightening of her jaw every time Ricky placed his hand on the small of her back for the photographers. He saw the dead, hollow look in her eyes. Declan stepped up beside him. "The senator looks confident, boss. Volkov money is keeping him afloat." Kieran didn't reply. His hands, resting in his pockets, curled into tight fists. He felt an alien sensation burning in his chest, a hot, dark, vicious rage. Kieran had killed men with his bare hands. He had burned rival businesses to the ground without a second thought. But watching a corrupt politician press his hand against the injured back of his wife made Kieran want to burn the entire city down. "Get the car," Kieran murmured, his voice deadly quiet. "We just got here, boss. Get the car, Declan." Kieran turned and walked out of the ballroom, unable to watch for another second without doing something that would start an all-out war. But a seed had been planted, a dark, obsessive seed. Madeline Lawson was drowning, and the monster inside Kieran Walsh had decided he was going to pull her out of the water, even if he had to drown her husband to do it. It was 3 days later when the world finally cracked in half. The winter storm hit Boston with unprecedented fury, dumping inches of sleet and snow onto the streets, freezing the city into a standstill. At the Lawson townhouse, the temperature was just as cold. Ricky had lost a major endorsement. He came home at 1 a.m., practically vibrating with fury. Madeline had been asleep in the guest room. She had been sleeping there all week to protect her bruised back when the door was kicked open. She didn't even have time to scream. Ricky dragged her out of bed by her hair. It was a blur of chaos, shouting and violence. He struck her across the face, the heavy gold ring on his right hand catching her cheekbone. She fell hard against the nightstand, tasting copper. He kicked her in the ribs, screaming about loyalty, about leaks, about the campaign. "You're bad luck," he screamed, standing over her as she curled into a fetal position. "Get out! Get the hell out of my sight before I kill you!" Madeline didn't wait for him to change his mind. Running on pure, terrified adrenaline, she grabbed her heavy wool coat, shoved her bare feet into a pair of boots, and ran out the front door into the freezing, sleet-filled night. She ran blindly down the icy cobblestones of Beacon Hill, her breath tearing through her throat in ragged gasps. She had no phone, no wallet, no destination. She just needed to be away. The sleet sliced at her exposed face, washing away the blood that trickled from her cut cheek. After walking for what felt like hours, her body numb and shivering violently, she saw the neon glow of a 24-hour diner on the edge of the South End. O'Rourke's. It was a gritty, run-down place, but it had lights. It had heat. Madeline pushed through the heavy glass doors, the bell jingling weakly. The diner was empty, save for a bored waitress wiping down the counter and a single patron sitting in the back booth, his face obscured by the shadows. Madeline slid into a booth near the front, pulling her coat tight around her. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the adrenaline faded, leaving only agonizing pain and bone-deep cold. In the back booth, Kieran Walsh froze. He was at O'Rourke's waiting for an informant to deliver shipping manifests. He had been staring at his black coffee, his mind calculating logistics. But the moment the bell jingled and the drenched, shivering woman walked in, his world stopped. He recognized her instantly. Even with wet hair plastered to her skull, even dressed in a mismatched coat and boots, he knew the curve of her shoulders. He knew the way she tried to make herself small. Kieran stood up. He moved silently, smoothly, like a panther closing in on its prey. He walked down the aisle and slid into the booth opposite her. Madeline jumped violently, letting out a choked gasp, her hands flying up defensively to protect her face. When she realized who was sitting across from her, her eyes widened in pure horror. Kieran Walsh. Here. Now. Of all the people in the city to witness her complete degradation, it was the terrifying mob boss she poured wine for. "Mr. Walsh," she stammered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. I'm sorry, I didn't know you were here. I'll leave." "Sit down," Kieran commanded. The volume of his voice was low, but the authority was absolute. It nailed her to the vinyl seat. Kieran leaned forward, the ambient neon light finally catching his face. His eyes were wide, taking in the horrific sight of her. Her lips were blue from the cold. Her expensive wool coat was soaked through. But that wasn't what made the blood in Kieran's veins turn to ice. It was the fresh, bleeding cut on her cheekbone. And as she shivered, the collar of her coat slipped down, revealing her neck. The bruises were grotesque. Dark purple, black, and angry yellow fingerprints wrapped around her pale throat, descending down to her collarbone. They were the undeniable marks of a man who had tried to strangle the life out of her. Kieran stared at the bruises. The silence in the diner stretched out, heavy and suffocating. The air pressure around the booth seemed to drop. Madeline quickly pulled the coat back up, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "Please," she whispered brokenly. "Please don't look at me." "Who did this?" Kieran asked. His voice didn't sound like his own. It was a terrifying, hollow rasp. It was the sound of a safety latch being taken off a loaded weapon. "I fell," she lied instinctively, the ingrained reflex of an abused wife. "On the ice. I slipped." Kieran's jaw locked, the muscles in his neck strained against his collar. Slowly, deliberately, he reached across the table. Madeline flinched, but he didn't grab her. He placed his large, warm, calloused hand gently over her freezing, trembling fingers. "Madeline," Kieran said, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying fire as they locked onto hers. "Do not lie to me. I deal with liars all day. I kill liars. Do not insult my intelligence." A sob ripped from her throat. She tried to pull her hand away, but his grip was firm, grounding her. "Tell me," he demanded softly. "Give me the name." "You know his name," she wept, the dam finally breaking. "You know exactly who I am. You know who my husband is." Kieran exhaled slowly. Ricky Lawson, the golden boy of the state senate, the man who lectured the public on morality while taking Russian bribes, the man who had put his hands on the woman Kieran had spent the last month quietly obsessing over. Something inside Kieran Walsh broke. It wasn't a clean break. It was a violent, catastrophic shattering of the thin wall separating his restrained, calculated business persona from the ruthless, bloodthirsty gangster he truly was. He slid out of the booth and stood up. He didn't say another word. He simply reached down, gripped Madeline gently by the elbow, and pulled her to her feet. "What are you doing?" she panicked, trying to pull back. "Where are we going?" "You're getting in my car," Kieran said, wrapping his own dry cashmere overcoat around her shivering shoulders. "And then I'm going to make a phone call." "No," she whispered fiercely, terrified. "Ricky will kill me. He'll kill you. You don't know who he is, what he can do." Kieran stopped. He turned to face her, looking down at her terrified, bruised face. The terrifying calmness in his eyes made her breath catch. "No, Madeline," Kieran whispered, his thumb lightly brushing the uninjured side of her cheek. "He doesn't know what I can do, but by tomorrow morning, there won't be enough left of Ricky Lawson to fill a cigar box." He guided her toward the door, into the violent winter storm. The 2 a.m. darkness swallowed them whole. But as Kieran led her toward his waiting Maybach, Madeline realized for the first time in her life that she wasn't walking into the darkness. She was walking with the devil himself, and for the first time, she felt entirely safe. The interior of the Maybach was a sensory deprivation chamber compared to the howling Boston tempest outside. The heavy doors sealed shut with a vault-like thud, instantly killing the sound of the sleet. Inside, it smelled of rich espresso leather, rain, and the faint, metallic underlying scent of Kieran's world, gunpowder and cold ambition. Madeline collapsed against the pristine upholstery, her teeth chattering so violently it echoed in the silent cabin. Kieran did not sit beside her immediately. He stood outside for a fraction of a second, speaking in a low, rapid-fire stream of Irish-laced English to Declan, who had materialized from the driver's seat. Declan's eyes widened slightly, darting to the bruised woman in the back, before he gave a curt nod and slid behind the wheel. Kieran climbed into the back, bringing a rush of freezing air with him before the door sealed again. He didn't crowd her. He sat on the opposite side of the spacious cabin, his posture rigid, his stormy grey eyes tracking the violent shudders racking her fragile frame. "Turn the heat up, Max," Kieran ordered, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Yes, boss," Declan replied, throwing the massive vehicle into drive. The Maybach glided away from the curb, leaving the neon glow of O'Rourke's behind, melting into the shadows of the financial district. Madeline pulled Kieran's heavy cashmere coat tighter around herself, her fingers digging into the expensive fabric as if it were a life raft. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a creeping, paralyzing terror. She was in a car with the head of the Irish syndicate. Her husband, a sitting state senator, was a violent sociopath who would notice she was gone by morning. She had just traded a gilded cage for a titanium vault. "Mr. Walsh," she whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't look at him, staring blindly at the privacy partition. "You can't do this. Ricky has the police commissioner on speed dial. He has the Volkov family backing his dark money pack. If he finds out I'm with you, he will bring the entire city down on your head." Kieran remained perfectly still. He reached into his suit pocket, pulling out a heavy, monogrammed silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and held it out to her. "Drink," he said flatly. "It's Irish whiskey. It will stop the shivering." She hesitated, then took the flask with trembling hands. The liquor burned a fiery trail down her throat, settling deep in her chest, forcing a ragged cough from her bruised lungs. "Senator Lawson is a loud man," Kieran said softly, the gravel in his voice completely devoid of fear. "Loud men rely on the threat of noise to keep people in line. I, Madeline, do not make noise. By the time your husband realizes I have dismantled his life, he won't have a mouth left to scream with." The absolute certainty in his tone sent a different kind of shiver down her spine. It wasn't a boast. It was an architectural blueprint of destruction. The car bypassed Beacon Hill entirely, heading toward the Seaport District. They pulled into an underground, heavily fortified private garage beneath a towering glass monolith of luxury condominiums. The building was owned entirely by a shell corporation Kieran controlled. The elevator ride to the penthouse bypassed every other floor, requiring a retinal scan from Kieran to even operate. When the steel doors parted, Madeline stepped into a world of sprawling, minimalist wealth. floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Boston harbor, the black water churning under the winter storm. But she barely registered the art or the sweeping views. Her knees finally gave out. Before she could hit the imported hardwood floor, Kieran caught her. His hands, so capable of dispensing brutal violence, were startlingly gentle as they hooked under her arms. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her down a long, shadowed hallway into a massive guest bedroom. "Declan!" Kieran barked over his shoulder as he laid her carefully atop the silk duvet. "Call Dr. Kavanaugh. Tell him to get here in 10 minutes, or I'll break his hands." "On it," Declan's voice echoed from the foyer. Madeline curled into a tight ball, the agony in her ribs flaring violently now that the adrenaline was entirely gone. "No doctors!" she gasped, panic seizing her throat. "Doctors have to report. They have to report domestic abuse. Ricky will know. It will ruin the campaign, and he'll kill me." Kieran sat on the edge of the mattress. He leaned over her, invading her space, his presence an immovable mountain of dark energy. "Look at me, Madeline." She forced her eyes open, meeting his. "Dr. William Kavanaugh lost his medical license a decade ago for patching up my men without asking questions," Kieran said, his voice dropping to a hypnotic, reassuring murmur. "He exists outside the law, just like I do, just like you do. Now, you are in my territory. The laws of Massachusetts do not apply in this room. Ricky Lawson does not exist in this room." For the first time in 5 years, Madeline believed it. The suffocating anxiety that constantly gripped her chest loosened by a microscopic fraction. She squeezed her eyes shut, and a single tear slipped down her bruised cheek. Kieran reached out, his thumb gently wiping away the tear, careful not to touch the swollen skin. Dr. Kavanaugh arrived exactly 9 minutes later, breathless and carrying a battered black leather medical bag. He took one look at Kieran's murderous expression and didn't utter a single pleasantry. Kieran stepped out of the room, standing like a stone sentinel in the hallway, while the doctor examined her. The door was cracked, and Kieran listened to the quiet murmurs. 3 fractured ribs. Dr. Kavanaugh's voice drifted out, strictly professional. Severe contusions on the cervical vertebrae, defensive bruising on the forearms. The laceration on the zygomatic bone will need butterfly stitches to avoid a scar. She's malnourished, severely dehydrated, and suffering from acute psychological trauma. Every word was a nail driven into the coffin Kieran was building for the senator in his mind. When Kavanaugh emerged, he looked pale. "She's sedated, Kieran. She needs absolute rest. If one of those ribs had splintered inward, it would have punctured a lung." "Can she be moved?" Kieran asked, his voice dead. "Not for at least 48 hours. Why?" "Because," Kieran said, walking past the doctor toward the living room, "we are going to war." Hours later, as the digital clock on the bedside table read 6 a.m., Madeline woke up. The heavy sedatives made the room swim, but the agonizing pain in her chest had dulled to a heavy ache. The room was bathed in the pale blue light of dawn. Sitting in a leather armchair in the corner of the room was Kieran. He had shed his suit jacket and tie. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing thick, corded forearms covered in faded, violent scars. He was staring at her, a tumbler of amber liquid forgotten in his hand. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice raspy. "I protect what is mine," Kieran replied instantly. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with a possessive intensity that made Madeline's breath hitch. She wasn't just a refugee. In his eyes, she was a claim. "He's going to realize I'm gone," she said, pulling the duvet to her chin. "He has a press conference at noon regarding the waterfront redevelopment project." Kieran leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The waterfront project. the one where he awarded the structural contracts to Viktor Volkov's construction firms, bypassing the union bids. Madeleine's eyes widened. How do you know that? I know everything that happens on my docks, Kieran said coldly. What I don't know is how he's hiding the kickbacks. Volkov isn't stupid enough to wire money to a politician. Madeleine swallowed hard. The terror of betrayal warred with the desperate need for revenge. Ricky had nearly killed her. He had promised to destroy her. It was time to strike the match. It's not wired, Madeleine breathed softly. It's a ledger. A physical, blue, leather-bound ledger. He doesn't trust digital footprints. He hides it behind the replica portrait of John Adams in his private study on Louisburg Square. It details every bribe, every offshore account, every shell company the Volkovs use to pay him. Kieran stood up slowly. The predatory gleam in his eyes was blinding. A physical ledger, in a house currently occupied by a hungover, panicking politician. He has security, Madeleine warned, her heart hammering. Armed guards. Good, Kieran smiled. It was a terrifying, feral expression. I was hoping for some exercise. At 9 a.m., the historic townhouse on Louisburg Square was a war zone of a different kind. Ricky Lawson paced the length of his mahogany-paneled study, his face flushed, violently hurling a crystal tumbler against the brick fireplace. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, but it didn't soothe the burning panic in his gut. What do you mean she's nowhere on the security cameras? Ricky screamed into his cell phone. On the other end, his chief of security stammered. Senator, the sleet knocked out the exterior cameras at 1:15 a.m. We have no visual of Mrs. Lawson leaving the premises. I have men checking the local hospitals and hotels. She has no money, Ricky roared, gripping the edge of his antique desk. She has no coat. She can't have just vanished. He slammed the phone down. He wasn't worried about Madeleine's safety. He was terrified of the timing. The Boston Globe had sent an aggressive investigative reporter, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, to sniff around the waterfront project. If Madeleine, bruised and battered, walked into a police station or a newsroom, his political career would instantly vaporize. And worse, Viktor Volkov would have him butchered for exposing the syndicate. The heavy mahogany doors to the study opened, and Ricky's campaign manager, a weaselly man named Peterson, scurried in. Ricky, the press conference is in 3 hours. We need Madeleine for the photo op. The family values angle is slipping in the polls. Madeleine has the flu, Ricky snapped, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. She is bedridden. Issue a statement. Ricky, Viktor Volkov is on line 1. He sounds displeased. Ricky's blood ran cold. He snatched the receiver off the desk phone. Viktor, good morning. Where is the package, Ricky? Viktor Volkov's heavy Russian accent slithered through the phone line like venom. My men at the docks report a disruption. 3 of my shipping containers were seized by customs at 5 a.m. this morning, an anonymous tip. Ricky frowned, confusion cutting through his panic. Customs? Viktor, I don't control federal customs. I handle zoning and state permits. The tip came from South Boston, Ricky. The Irish. Kieran Walsh is making a move. I pay you a very large sum of money to ensure my operations run smoothly. If Walsh is interrupting my supply chain, it means you are failing. I will handle it, Ricky lied smoothly, sweat beading on his forehead. Walsh is a thug. I'll have the police commissioner raid his underground clubs tonight. See that you do, Viktor hung up. Ricky collapsed into his leather chair, rubbing his temples. Everything was unraveling. He needed a drink. He turned around, his eyes landing on the replica portrait of John Adams hanging on the wall. Behind that painting was his life insurance. If everything went to hell, the ledger had enough dirt on the Volkovs to secure him a federal immunity deal. Little did Ricky know, a ghost was already moving through his house. 2 miles away, in the impregnable seaport penthouse, Madeline was sitting up in bed, sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea Declan had brought her. She felt like she was living in a surreal dream. The violent, chaotic world she had inhabited for 5 years felt 1,000,000 miles away, replaced by the silent, lethal efficiency of Kieran's operation. The bedroom door opened, and Kieran walked in. He was dressed in a tailored, midnight black suit, looking every inch the corporate raider, but the shoulder holster strapped over his crisp white shirt betrayed his true profession. "How is the pain?" he asked, standing at the foot of the bed. "Manageable," Madeline lied. It hurt to breathe, but she refused to show weakness. Not anymore. "What did you do?" "I woke up the customs director at 4 a.m., Kieran said casually, checking his gold Patek Philippe watch. "I gave him the shipping manifest for 3 of Viktor Volkov's illegal weapons shipments arriving at the port of Boston. Your husband just got a very angry phone call." Madeline gasped. "You provoked the Volkovs. Kieran, they are ruthless. They'll start a street war." "I thrive in street wars, Madeline," Kieran said, stepping closer to the bed. "But this isn't about territory anymore. This is a chess match, and I just tipped over Ricky's queen. I needed him distracted." "Distracted from what?" "From his study," Kieran smiled. At that exact moment, back in Louisburg Square, Ricky's chief of security walked into the kitchen to pour a cup of coffee. He never saw the shadow drop from the ceiling duct. A massive, scarred hand clamped over his mouth, and a heavy blow to the back of his neck rendered him instantly unconscious. Declan, moving with terrifying silence, lowered the guard to the floor. He tapped his earpiece. "Security is down. I'm moving to the study." Through the earpiece, Kieran's voice crackled. "You have 60 seconds, Declan. If Lawson sees you, put him to sleep, but do not kill him. I want him alive for the finale." Declan slipped down the hallway. He cracked the door to the study. Ricky was standing at the window, his back turned, staring nervously at the street below. Declan didn't hesitate. He moved across the carpeted floor, unhinged the John Adams portrait, and punched the default factory override code Kieran had sourced for that specific brand of wall safe. Click. Declan pulled the heavy metal door open, reached inside, and grabbed the blue leather-bound ledger. He closed the safe, rehung the painting, and faded back into the hallway like smoke. Ricky never even turned around. 10 minutes later, Declan walked into the seaport penthouse and tossed the blue ledger onto the massive marble kitchen island. Kieran flipped it open, his eyes scanning the handwritten entries. He let out a low, dark chuckle. Accounts in the Caymans, bribes listed as consulting fees to phantom LLCs. He even documented the exact dates Viktor Volkov paid him to rezone the shipyard. Kieran looked up, his eyes locking onto Madeline, who had limped into the doorway of the kitchen, clutching her robe. "This is a masterpiece of corruption." "What are you going to do with it?" Madeline asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. "Give it to the FBI." "The FBI is too slow," Kieran said, slamming the ledger shut. "And they would put you on a witness stand. I will not allow you to be paraded in front of a jury and cross-examined by his expensive lawyers. No, we are going to destroy him in the court of public opinion, and then I will leave him to the wolves." But the wolves were already at the door. Kieran's cell phone vibrated on the marble counter. It was an encrypted number. He answered it, putting it on speaker. "Walsh," a thick Russian voice growled. It was Viktor Volkov. "You seized my shipments. You overstep." "You operate in my city, Viktor," Kieran said smoothly, leaning against the counter. "You pay a cheap politician to bypass my unions. I consider that an insult." "I do not care about your feelings," Viktor spat. But I think we have a bigger problem. My men were tracking the movements around Senator Lawson's house this morning. They saw your dog, Declan, slipping out the back alley. Victor paused, and the silence was heavier than a loaded gun. Lawson is missing something very important. A blue book. And he is missing a wife. Madeline's blood ran cold. She stepped back, bumping into the doorframe. "You have the book, Kieran," Victor deduced, his voice dropping an octave. "And you have the senator's property. I want the book. If you give it to me, I will let you keep the woman. If you don't..." "If I don't what, Victor?" Kieran's voice was a terrifying whisper. "I know about the penthouse in the seaport. I have 50 men armed with automatic weapons pulling into the underground garage right now. Hand over the ledger, or I will turn your glass tower into a graveyard." Kieran didn't blink. He looked at Madeline, who was paralyzed with fear, her eyes wide, realizing the war had just arrived at their doorstep. Kieran reached under the marble island, pulling a heavy, matte black assault rifle from a hidden magnetic mount. He racked the slide, the metallic clack echoing loudly in the sprawling, silent penthouse. "Come and get it, Victor," Kieran said, and hung up the phone. He turned to Madeline, his grey eyes blazing with a protective fury that stole the breath from her lungs. "Go to the panic room. Now." The penthouse transformed instantly. With the push of a single button on a sleek wall panel, inch-thick ballistic steel shutters descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows, sealing them off from the freezing Boston night. The ambient lighting shifted to a tactical, dim red. "Declan, get her in the vault," Kieran commanded, his voice devoid of panic, resonating with cold, calculated precision. He racked the bolt of his rifle, his eyes already locked on the reinforced oak double doors of the main entrance. Madeline grabbed Kieran's arm, her fingers digging into his dark suit jacket. "They're going to kill you," she breathed, her heart hammering against her fractured ribs. "Victor has an army." Kieran looked down at her hand, then up to her terrified eyes. A dark, reassuring smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Victor has thugs. I have an architecture of death, Madeline. You just sit tight and watch the monitors." Declan pulled her away, guiding her down the hall and shoving her into a hidden, titanium-reinforced panic room behind a false bookcase. The heavy door hissed shut, locking her in a silent, brightly lit sanctuary lined with surveillance monitors. On the screens, she could see the entirety of the building's security feed. It began in the underground garage. 3 unmarked black SUVs smashed through the security gates. Heavily armed men in tactical gear poured out, shooting the exterior cameras. But Kieran's hidden secondary cameras tracked their every move. They split up, swarming the stairwells and bypassing the elevators, which Kieran had already disabled. But as Madeline watched the monitors, a new, chilling development unfolded. On the roof feed, a sleek, black, unmarked helicopter descended through the sleet. Men rappelled down, but they weren't Russian mobsters. They were wearing Boston PD SWAT uniforms, and stepping off the helicopter, clutching a heavy coat against the wind, was Ricky Lawson. Madeline's blood ran cold. Ricky had called in his corrupt favors. He had brought Captain Donovan, a man known to be on Ricky's private payroll, to orchestrate an off-the-books raid under the guise of a hostage situation. Ricky was here to retrieve his blue ledger and silence his wife permanently, before the Volkovs could get their hands on either. "Kieran!" Madeline screamed, pressing the intercom button on the console. "The roof! Ricky is on the roof with SWAT!" In the living room, Kieran heard her voice crackle through the hidden speakers. He didn't flinch. He simply tapped his earpiece. "Liam, Finn, the Russians are in the eastern stairwell. Flood it with the tear gas and lock the fire doors. Let them choke. Declan, you're with me. We have a politician to greet." The penthouse doors blew inward with a deafening explosion. Smoke and splintered wood filled the foyer as Captain Donovan's corrupt strike team breached from the roof access stairs. But Kieran and Declan weren't in the foyer. They were positioned behind heavy marble pillars in the sunken living area, caught in the shadows. Gunfire erupted, shattering the expensive artwork and tearing through the designer furniture. It was deafening, a chaotic symphony of violence. But Kieran moved with the lethal grace of an apex predator. He didn't spray bullets. He took calculated, single shots. 2 SWAT members dropped instantly, shot through the unprotected gaps in their body armor. "Hold fire! Hold fire!" Captain Donovan yelled, realizing they had walked into a slaughterhouse. Ricky stepped into the smoke-filled foyer, coughing, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He held a silver revolver, looking completely out of his element, but driven by pure, desperate madness. "Where is she, Walsh?" Ricky screamed over the ringing silence. "Where is my wife, and where is my property?" Kieran stepped out from behind the marble pillar. His rifle hung by its strap. He had drawn a heavy, matte black 1911 pistol. He looked at Ricky with absolute disgust. "Your property?" Kieran echoed, his voice slicing through the smoke. "You don't own anything anymore, Ricky. Not the docks, not the Blue Ledger, and certainly not her." Ricky raised his revolver, his hands shaking violently. "I am a United States Senator. I will end you." "You're a dead man walking," Kieran replied softly. "Did you really think I didn't make copies?" Ricky froze. "The moment Declan brought me that blue book," Kieran continued, pacing slowly like a wolf circling a wounded stag, "I had my tech team scan every single page. 10 minutes ago, an encrypted file was sent to the Massachusetts Attorney General, the FBI field office, and the investigative desk at the Boston Globe. You aren't here to save your career, Ricky. You're here to attend its funeral." Sirens wailed in the distance. Not a few, dozens. The real police, the feds. They were swarming the Seaport district. Down in the garage, the sirens caused Victor Volkov's men to panic and scatter, turning the siege into a chaotic retreat. Ricky's face drained of all color. The realization that his empire was turning to ash in real time broke his mind. With a guttural scream, he aimed the revolver blindly and pulled the trigger. Kieran moved faster than thought. He sidestepped the wild shot, closed the distance in 2 massive strides, and gripped Ricky's wrist, twisting it violently. The bone snapped with a sickening crunch. Ricky shrieked, dropping the gun. Kieran didn't stop. He drove his knee into Ricky's stomach, dropping the politician to the floor. As Ricky gasped for air, Kieran grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive coat and hauled him up, slamming him against the wall. "This," Kieran hissed, his grey eyes burning with demonic fury, "is for the bruises on her neck." Kieran pulled his fist back and drove it into Ricky's jaw. The impact was devastating. Ricky collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, spitting blood and teeth onto the imported hardwood, utterly broken. By 6 a.m., the storm had broken, leaving the Boston skyline glittering under a cold, crisp sunrise. The penthouse was a wreck of shattered glass and bullet holes, but the silence had returned. Outside the steel shutters, the flashing red and blue lights of federal vehicles painted the streets below. Ricky Lawson had been dragged out of the building in handcuffs, a bloody, weeping mess paraded directly past the flashing cameras of the local news stations. Captain Donovan and his corrupt squad were disarmed and arrested by the FBI. As for Victor Volkov, the feds intercepted him at Logan Airport, trying to board a private jet to Moscow, armed with the evidence from the Blue Ledger. In the titanium panic room, the heavy door finally clicked and swung open. Madeline stood up, her breath catching in her throat. Kieran stood in the doorway. His black suit was covered in white plaster dust. His knuckles were bruised and bloody, and there was a dark smear of soot across his cheek. He looked exhausted, dangerous, and incredibly beautiful. He didn't say a word. He stepped into the room, holstered his weapon, and looked at her. Madeline didn't hesitate. She closed the distance between them, wrapping her arms around his waist and burying her face in his chest. Kieran let out a heavy, shuddering breath, his large arms coming around her, pulling her tightly against him. He was careful, so incredibly careful, to avoid her fractured ribs. He rested his chin on the top of her head, his eyes closing. "It's over," Kieran murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "He's gone, Madeline. He will spend the rest of his miserable life in a federal supermax, and he will never, ever lay a hand on you again." Tears streamed down her face, soaking into his ruined shirt. For the first time in her adult life, they were tears of absolute relief. The monster who had tormented her was locked away, destroyed by a different kind of monster, one who had looked at her broken pieces and decided to burn the world down to protect her. "Thank you," she sobbed quietly, clinging to him. Kieran pulled back just enough to look at her face. He reached up, his bloody knuckles contrasting sharply with her pale, bruised skin, and gently traced the line of her uninjured cheek. "You are safe now," he whispered fiercely, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers. "You are mine to protect, always." As the morning sun broke over the harbor, piercing through the gaps in the steel shutters, Madeline looked into the stormy grey eyes of the Mafia Boss and knew she had finally found her home. The line between a monster and a savior is often drawn in blood. For Madeline Lawson, survival meant escaping the pristine, terrifying grip of a politically polished sociopath and falling into the shadowed, violent embrace of Boston's most feared syndicate boss. Kieran Walsh did not offer her a life of lawful innocence. He offered her absolute, unapologetic devotion. He recognized the language of her trauma, the hidden bruises beneath her silk dresses, and responded with a ruthless, calculated destruction of her abuser. In the aftermath of the shattered glass and federal indictments, the hierarchy of power in the city was forever altered. But more importantly, the bruised sommelier was no longer a victim. Bound by shared shadows and a fiercely protective love, Madeline finally learned that true safety wasn't found in gilded cages, but in the arms of the man who tore the cage apart.